Okay, thank you, Alessandro. Thanks for the participants. Thanks for this initiative. I will closely follow my PowerPoint slides. Otherwise, I will be more perhaps lively, but more confused. So let me follow the slides. So the title I decided is a concept of surplus in contemporary economics and its application to the ancient civilizations towards an alliance between the modern classical approach and ancient studies. There's no PowerPoint, PDF. Okay. After having been shaken in the 1930s by the Keynesian challenge, in the 60s, the dominant neoclassical or marginalist theory was stunned by a second challenge that concerned the theory of capital, the specific analytical aspect of marginalism that were raised by Piero Sraffa and originated the famous controversy between the two Cambridges. Famous, I hope, but I will say something about that. Nothing ideological. The challenge was about complex analytical problems that undermined the foundation of that theory of marginalism. The American Cambridge admitted defeat, but the mainstream also managed to relegate the controversy to the top shelves of libraries. The battle was won, not the war. Alongside Sraffa, two younger Italian economists, Pierangelo Garignani and Luigi Pasinetti, led the Cambridge UK. However, Sraffa's contribution is not only limited to this critical aspect, but also from a positive point of view. It recovered the standpoint of the old classical economists, from Adam Smith to David Ricardo, submerged and forgotten since the advent of the marginal method at the end of the 19th century. Essential in the classical approach is the notion of social surplus. Here, to give some relevance to the economist I mentioned, is Presidente Napolitano in 2011, with the first on the left is Luigi Pasinetti, and the second is Pierangelo Garignani at the University of Roma 3. It was the occasion was a conference on Sraffa. The surplus approach is encapsulated in the formula pi minus p minus n equal s, where s is that part of the physical net social product, p, net of the reproduction of the means of production, which is left once workers' necessary consumption, n is paid. So the social surplus can be defined as that part of the social product left once society has put aside what is necessary to reproduce the social output, at least at the current level, and that can thus safely be used for any other purpose, the surplus. This formula is applicable to all social formations under investigation as the core, but I would prefer the expression material answer, of historical and institutional analysis. The surplus approach is by definition an open system, one that must be completed by historical institutional analysis. So I will briefly, in this presentation, I will briefly deal with three approaches to economics, institutional and pre-capitalist societies. The surplus approach, I just mentioned, the classical surplus approach, Polanyi, and mainstream marginalism, mainstream economics, the neoclassical theory, which include, in my view, new institutional economics. And why everybody criticized the others, I think that there is a way to reconcile the classical surplus approach with some elements from Polanyi's theory, but possibly also with some aspect on new institutional economics. However, I will hope to be able to say something about that. Nothing is black and white. I mean, there are gray areas in which opposite conceptions of economics can, however, maybe find something in common. My interest in ancient studies research was born by reading Jared Diamond's famous Guns, Germs, and Steel. He widely relied on the notion of social surplus, so a curiosity rose if this reliance was more generally widespread among anthropologists and archaeologists and students of ancient economies, of course. And it was so. I was fascinated by the important economic issue you discuss in ancient studies, particularly with regard to the origins of inequality and social stratification and of their accompanying institution. The adoption of surplus theory to approach the study of ancient civilization actually began with classical economics in the 18th century with Turgoyen, of course, with Adam Smith. And it was based on the association between the material ways to produce the subsistence with the related institutions at each given stage of development. As much as in modern ancient studies, for classical economists, the concept of surplus was an obvious concept. I was reading, I mean, I suppose that some of you may have met the concept of surplus in the findings, archaeological findings in Mesopotamia or elsewhere, because this is an obvious concept in a sense. My purpose here is indeed to provide the scholars of ancient economies a more robust analytical foundation to a concept they already often employ. The French physiocrats were, for instance, were among the initiators of the surplus approach. And their approach, the way to look, the way they presented the surplus approach is still really fascinating. Quesnay, tableau économique, we are in the second half of the 18th century, can be taken as a theory, as a representation of the tributary state or the redistributive state. In the tableau économique, out of the surplus produced by the productive agricultural class, two unproductive classes live: the sterile class of artisans, and the elite, that would include landlords, the state, and the church. And these two classes live out of the surplus produced by the productive agricultural class. And in the tableau économique, complicated transactions, interestingly using money, everything is started by monetary spending. These complicated transactions are traced by Quesnay among the three classes. And there is this idea of a circular economy that reproduces year after year through these complex transactions. And the mind goes to the redistributive state, the tributary state, with a temple of the king collecting the agricultural surplus as tax, rent, or direct production, both for its own consumption and for that of other unproductive classes, craftsmen, soldiers, priests, etc. And also the consumer city. I mean, you can see here the city, and here the land, the agriculture out of which the city would live. And indeed, in his seminar on December or so, Professor Michael Hughes used a similar circular way of reasoning, studying the working and reproduction of the economy under scrutiny. He did not use his favorite new institutional economics, and this is why, in my opinion, is why he particularly impressed me and my colleagues. Neoclassical economists, including new institutional economics, do not argue in terms of an economic and monetary circuit, but in a vertical way from production factors to consumption. Quesnay shows how it is the surplus obtained in the wage sector that identified with agriculture that sustains the unproductive classes. But the model can be generalized with manufacturing goods consumed both as subsistence and by the elite. So a surplus, things becomes more complicated, of course, because in this case, a surplus must be calculated can be calculated in the manufacturing sector, but this requires a theory of value. that is the measurement of magnitudes in value. I mean, if we go back to the simple surplus equation I introduced, of course, in agriculture, if let's say we take agriculture, wage goods consist only of corn, and the surplus can be measured in the agricultural sector, the corn sector. The magnitudes are measured in corns, so we can make this calculation. Whereas if we introduce a manufacturing sector and part of wages paid in manufacturing goods, the magnitudes must be measured in value. That is, we must know prices. There is even a Keynesian flavor in Keynes and in Professor Hughes, in that it is money that triggers the circulation flow of commodities and income. And fulgy examples are in this regard Hopkins, 1980, and Crawford, 1970s, both writing on the Roman Empire. Of course, there are limits of Keynes approach and further developments of classical theory. The limit of Keynes is, of course, the definition of the manufacturing sector as sterile, as not producing a surplus. Of course, the surplus is physically evident in agriculture. The P minus N equal S is simply calculable in a corn economy, while it's the result of a transformation process in manufacturing, a valorization process. In its more general form, the social surplus will appear in this case as a difference between the value of the output and the value of the necessities to the workers and of the capital goods consumed in production. Each component in the equation P minus N equal S is actually a collection of commodities that can be summed up only in value, knowing the four prices. The theory of value is needed. David Ricardo and after him Karl Marx adopted the labor theory of value. The value of commodities is given by the amount of labor directly and indirectly employed to produce them. Unfortunately, both Ricardo and Marx, were great economists, recognized that, unfortunately, the labor theory of value has not a general validity. So is an insufficient way to measure these magnitudes. Karl Marx almost reached a solution that was perfectioned by various authors in the first part of the last century. And on the other side, unfortunately, orthodox Marxists still complain the necessity to abandon the labor theory of value, but preserving the surplus approach. But I mean, Marxists are, I doubt they are good economists. Sraffa reached autonomously the solution to that is a different way, a way different from the labor theory of value to measure these aggregates. Autonomously in the sense that he was not moving from Marx, from the point to which Marx arrived. And also, I mean, there have been authors before Sraffa that also reached the solution that Sraffa reached, but Sraffa reached this solution in a more, deep way, understanding the issues at stake in a deeper way than other authors. So there is a pax constituens and a pax destruens in the modern surplus approach. In the 1960s, independently from Sraffa, his favorite pupil Garignani published his Cambridge PhD thesis that Sraffa wanted to be published immediately in English, but I mean, unfortunately, only last year has been published in English. Anyway, in his PhD thesis, Garignani shown that the same order of problems that classical economists met in measuring P, N, and S, the marginalists met in a different theoretical context in measuring the stock of capital. In this theory, marginalists, the value of this factor of production, capital, is primary factor of production, must be known before determining price and distribution. But how can you measure K if prices are not yet determined? I mean, in this theory, you must know the value of the capital stock to determine prices and distributions, but you cannot measure capital in value if you do not know prices. So it's a vicious circle. While, however, and I mean, the problem of measurement of magnitudes is also met by was also met by the classical economists. I mean, Ricardo and Marx realized that a measurement through the labor content was not a valid way. I mean, even the early marginalists tried to measure K through the labor content. But the problems are similar, but in one theory, the classical approach, there is a solution. In the neoclassical theory, there is no analytical solution. So in the classical approach, the measurement problems of P, N, and S can be brought to a solution. This is not true for K in marginalist theory. In this theory, you must know the value of K to determine prices and distribution, but you cannot know the value of K if you don't already know prices. It's a clear vicious circle. Okay, let's jump this. In 1960, in his small book, Sraffa added other problems to neoclassical capital theory. They were the object of the controversy between the two Cambridge. The Italian Cambridge won the battle, as we say, and explicitly Paul Samuelson, that led the American economists at MIT defending the neoclassical theory. The Italian Cambridge won the battle, but not the war. The strategy after the controversy by neoclassical, by mainstream economists has been of ignoring the results of this controversy. It works because you don't talk anymore about this. Students don't know anything. The younger generation of economists totally ignore the problem. And those by Garignani and Sraffa are direct critiques of neoclassical theory. Neoclassical theory has been subject of many critiques. For instance, neoclassical economists assume rational individuals, they assume perfect knowledge, but often these are just simplification, but these are acceptable, or just sort of critiques that are a matter of opinion. In my opinion, they are weak critiques. So in the Sarkis approach, there is a pax destruens, which is the analytical criticism of neoclassical theory. And the pax consequence is the revival of the classical Sarkis theory. The classical approach, the classical theory is open to any possible outcome of the distributive conflict. Can be egalitarian or exploitative. There is not a natural market harmonic equilibrium income distribution like in marginalism. And since the result of the distributive conflict depends on the historical circumstances, by necessity, the Sarkis approach needs to be completed by an analysis of historical social conditions and institutions. Adam Smith was, for instance, very sensitive, of course, to the historical and institutional dimension, much less Ricardo. I mean, Adam Smith was a philosopher, Ricardo was a merchant. But Ricardo, at the same time, was very sensitive to the political implication of his theory, conflict theory of distribution. I mean, Ricardo was very interested in the conflict between agricultural landlords and industrial capitalists. he used this theory to analyze the conflict between these two social classes. What Marx did, he used the same theory to analyze the conflict between labor and capital. And of course, but apart the suggestion we find in Smith and the interest of Ricardo to the political conflicts of his time, Ricardo was also a member of the English Parliament. It is Marx's historical materialism that gave the Sarpus approach a clear historical dimension. And the current ostracism towards Marx is one of the main intellectual disasters of our times, in my opinion. Because I think that even people that know that Marx is one of the greatest thinkers of the last 2 centuries or so, or ever, they are afraid to quote Marx. I mean, it's not very well accepted by the establishment, so to speak. The link between Sarpus theory and institutions naturally finds completion in Marx's historical materialism. Unfortunately, there is a sort of damnatio memoria on Marx. And do not forget that Marxism was born out of the perils of Ricardian theory, that was a conflict theory of distributions. Marx was dangerous because he explained exploitation using the same theory of Ricardo. Ricardo was not a socialist. The modern Sarpus approach is often called neo-Ricardian theory. To be sure, I look at historical materialism as a good sense approach to the social compact of material and cultural factors, while both what we call in Italian economicismo, in the explanation of social formations, that is, economics is all, and especially a finalistic grand view of history, I would firmly reject. And in my opinion, they are both more typical of the younger than of the mature Marx. Without being a Marxist, the Oxford historian Sheila Ogilvie looks at institution as preceding at income distribution, seen in turn as an arena of conflict, precisely as in classical economics. Sheila Ogilvie I found very interesting. She's also very critical in institutional economics. She doesn't refer to the Sarpus approach, but really, she contends that institutions are mainly, there are many institutions, but institutions in a vertical sense are mainly there to regulate income distributions. And of course, this is you think in this way when you rely on a conflict theory of income distribution. There is not much to be, okay, I'll come back on that. There is still much to ponder, moreover, on the concept of modes of production. I think the concept of mode of productions, as left by Marx, it is incomplete, or perhaps it is an open concept, especially from the point of view of the forces that determine the evolution of modes of production: technology, class conflict, health. Unfortunately, many of the Marxist debates on the subject are rather obscure, at least to me. Sometimes, and many debates also in Italy. Famous debate took place at Istituto Gramsci, for instance. At least to me, both Italian and French authors are often obscure. It's very difficult to me to read Althusser, for instance. I prefer British authors as Perry Anderson, Edward Thompson, the great Destéquois. Be this as it may, very soon I met the figure of Karl Polanyi. Polanyi was critical of the Sarpus approach. And my opinion is very unfortunate that he rejected it. In fact, his criticism is interesting and can be intended in a constructive sense. Polanyi criticized the mechanical uses of Sarpus theory, The automatism sometimes posited between technical possibility of producing a surplus, between a potential surplus, and the actual emergence of social stratification and civilization. As a Polanyi follower put it in the famous book of 1957, the concept of surplus is useful only where the conditions of a specific surplus are institutionally defined, since there are always and everywhere potential surpluses available. But what counts is the institutional means for bringing them to life. I think this is a constructive criticism, and it's not clear why Polanyi or person rejected the surplus approach. Similarly, anthropologists, well-known anthropologists, Murray Hart, recently argued that studying surplus is incomplete without considering the historical and subjective aspects of surplus, as it is connected to differing and overlapping institutional spheres. I agree that it doesn't make sense to talk of surplus in general as a generic abstraction, but only as a determinate abstraction, using the terminology of Marx, fully immersed in the historical institutional circumstances that transform potential in actual surpluses by organizing the surplus extraction and distribution. Some further criticisms to Polanyi. For both Polanyi and Moses Finlay, marginalism is appropriate as a good theory when applied to market economies, while it is wrong when applied to pre-capitalist formations, in which trade and, in general, economic relations were relatively less important. I have two reservations about this approach. Marginalism is analytical flawed, also when applied to capitalism, as shown by the critical work on capital theory with Raffa, Garignani, and Pasinetti. An economic analysis should not be identified with neoclassical theory. And economic relations were, of course, important also in pre-capitalist society. Then let me quote Marx, at least one famous sentence. Marx ironically commented, this much, however, is clear that the Middle Ages could not live on Catholicism, nor the ancient world on politics. So they could not live out of institutions of ideologies. On the contrary, it is the mode in which they gained the livelihood that explains why here politics and their Catholicism played the chief part. Don Quixote long ago paid the penalty from wrongly imagining that knight-errantry, an institution, was compatible with all economic forms of society. Of course, well before Polanyi, Marx pointed out that personal political relations regulated, and not markets, regulated economic relations in pre-capitalist economies, although markets also clearly exist. Not dissimilarly from capitalism, however, for Marx, the surplus equation shown above is at the core of the social relations that therefore did not operate in an economic vacuum. In pre-capitalist societies, institutional relations, formal and informal, have precisely the role of regulating the structures and distributions of the social surplus. Let me quote again Ogilvy. In the 60s and 80s, as students of ancient societies well know, fierce battles were fought under the flags of substantivist formalism on the one side, inspired by Polanyi and Finlay, versus primitives, modernism. Sorry, I mixed the terms. On the one side, primitivist and substantivist, Polanyi and Finlay, versus formalist, modernist, inspired by marginal economics. These groups of scholars fighting each other. A large part of this debate between scholars, students of ancient economists inspired by Polanyi and Finlay, and scholars inspired by neoclassical economics, a large part of this debate concerned whether the marginalist conceptual category of economizing the rational allocative choice of scarce means to alternative ends to maximize individual utility should be employed in the study of primitive society, or whether other principles and values should apply, for instance, forms of altruism and reciprocity. This Polanyian line of attack to the imperialist implication of marginalism is, in my opinion, unconvincing. Some economic calculation, rational calculation existed to begin with, also in primitive society, as Douglas North imputed to Polanyi, although not necessarily well described by the marginalist functions, of course. Formalists, that is, students inspired by neoclassical economics, had also easy life to defend a rational choice approach outside the strict economic and market realm, as applicable also to the context, to contexts where it is power, prestige, or else to be maximized. While altruism and reciprocity could also be interpreted in mere instrumental terms. Nonetheless, the technicity of the rational choice approach vis-à-vis the complexity and diversity of human society made Polanyi at that time attractive to generations of social students. It is a pity that, deprived of the surplus approach, Polanyi's lesson appears enervated, lacking an economic soul, a deficiency that is, however, possible to amend. The appearance of new institutional economics is said to have shaken, Marco Maiuro will talk about that, is said to have shaken things up by accepting that institutions other than markets exist in any social formations. Douglas North's contribution, of course, new institutional economics is a very large literature, and so I had to select. Douglas North's contribution has, however, undergone a continuous evolution, becoming increasingly elusive. I mean, Douglas is the main is representative of those part of new social economics interested not so much in industrial organization, that is Oliver Williamson's side, is those interested in economic history. Douglas North initially embraced the idea that of institutions as a rational solution to transaction costs, the cost of writing contracts in present or uncertainty, asymmetric information, etc. Well, this is my point of view, especially say that to Marco Maiuro. My perspective is that the transaction cost approach is interesting for analyzing micro problems of industrial organization. Define the problem of institutions in horizontal sense, the make or buy problems. North himself must have later perceived the transaction cost approach as inadequate for interpreting institution in a macro or vertical sense to explain income distribution, the emergence of elites, of state organization in the great civilizations. Imitating Marx, that Douglas North, no doubt, is one even a Marxist when he was young in Berkeley, we invidiously admired, North began to regard the question of property rights as a matter concerning political power, that is the state. Yet his analysis of the origins of the dominant elites' power is poor, to say the least. A degree of indeterminacy eventually dominates North's analysis, which relies on subjective elements as self-fulfilling beliefs and ideologies. Ogilvy is particularly critical in this regard. One should also not forget the marginalist background, of course, on new institutional economics. For new institutional economics, free market, the protection of free market property rights maximize the social welfare and growth. From here, the old marginalist obsession to find markets everywhere and the accompanying pro-market institutions. Of course, I mean, market existed also in all epochs. I think that when you deal with all the uncertain, with whatever economy, at whatever epoch, the interest question is the one that the Stekwa for my colleagues, economist colleagues, Stekwa was a Cambridge historian, a Marxist, but he was in Cambridge. In my opinion, I don't know how much his account of the Greek and Roman society is still valid. Certainly, the question which is essential, and he was very critical of Finlay, the question he put at the center of his work is that how did the elites derive their surplus? Which is the main question. I mean, they market, possibly in ancient economies, very often the elites did not derive their surplus from markets. They derive their surplus from other kind, by the control of the tributary state, for instance. And moreover, do not forget that anyway, there is exploitation also through markets. And the interest question is here, maybe the possible conflict among elites extracting a surplus in different ways. Ricardo, for instance, used this conflict theory to analyze the clash between agrarian landlords and commercial capitalists. So this to say, because New Classical Economics has the idea where markets are good, other economic institutions are bad. I mean, your exploitation in all economic modes, to use economic forms, to use a Marxist term. What is interesting is from where the elite derive its surplus, and if there is a clash between or cooperation between different modes of production, that is different way through which different parts of the elite, maybe one controlling the state, the other controlling the markets, if there was a conflict or maybe cooperation. Through institutional economics overcome some Finlay's and Polanyi's deficiencies regarding the relative neglect of the economic dimensions in antiquity, but the Stekwa indicated an alternative way out. I mean, with the questions, the questions I just recalled. Moreover, both the Raffian and the Keynesian criticism show that it is not generally true that markets bring about generalized welfare and growth. The origin of profit is in exploitations. Inequality then creates problems to aggregate demand. Incidentally, Raffa's analysis is essential to clean Keynes from all its marginalist legacies. Note also that I am not in principle against free markets and property rights. What I deny is that they have automatic growth and welfare implications. And I want to recall that they are also exploitative way to extract the surplus for the working population. And in this regard, I like to remember that Gunnar Myrdal, the economic inspirator of modern Scandinavian social democracy, is behind the awarding of the Söderström Gold Medal to Piero Sraffa by the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences in 1961. And this is not the case because Gunnar Myrdal, first of all, the gold medal was was a sort of Nobel Prize in economics, because Nobel Prize of Economics, so-called Nobel Prize of Economics, is a Bank of Sweden Nobel Prize. It's not Swedish Royal Academy of Science Nobel Prize, and was created later at the end of the 60s. So it did not exist at the time. And few economists got this gold medal, Piero Sraffa and John Maynard Keynes among them. And Myrdal appreciated Sraffa because Sraffa rediscovered the classical conflict theory of distribution. And Myrdal regarded the social democrat solution, the social democracy as a way to bring social conflict within labor capital to a compromise. But his distribution theory was a conflict theory, and he appreciated that Sraffa recovered this point of view. And here, okay, here's the picture when Sraffa received from the King of Sweden, the 1961, the Golden Medal. Here is the young Sraffa with Keynes in 1931. I can, what time is it? I have 2 minuti? Sì, 20 minutes is even too much. Since there is still time, I want just to mention some recent research that on ancient economists that probably is unknown to most of the scholars of ancient economists that are listening me. That research that appear in the top flag, in the top 5 economic journals. So is and which is very interesting of an actual way, an actual reproposition, if you want, of the old formalist approach in ancient studies, that the direct use of marginal instruments, of classical instrument in analyzing ancient societies. And what is interesting of these economists, but you see in bold, I put names of archaeologists. Allen is a student, I can't remember the first name, but Allen is a student of Egypt. Archaeologist must be a very famous one, suppose. So there is Sam Bowles is well known in Italy, is a sort of radical neoclassical economist. So these economists and archaeologists are mixing up in a way which is interesting. I define them materialist marginalists in the sense that what they do is they pick up hypotheses from the non-economic literature, very often from archaeologists, and very often the archaeologists used the surplus, use explicitly the surplus approach, use the concept of surplus. And what these economists and archaeologists do is to re-explain, re-expose the same materialist hypothesis about the born of inequality and stratification. They reformulate these hypotheses using neoclassical instruments. What is interesting that all these papers, I focus on these 3 recent papers. I mean, the first by Bogart, Cesaratto and Bowles revisit the role of the adoption of the oxen-drawn plow, the aratro trainato dai buoi, in the early insurgent of inequality, an hypothesis formulated among others by Paul Alstead. Maishar, Moab, and Pascali do the same, re-examining the role of serial storage in the outset of inequality. Allen, Bertazzini, Heldring revisit the time-honored hydraulic hypothesis. all these papers openly reject the surplus theory. We are very poor arguments indeed, but it's interesting that we want to criticize the surplus approach because probably they feel that in a spontaneous way, without referring to Zeraff or to Marx or to Ricardo or to Adam Smith, students of ancient societies very often, or especially archaeologists, we should not forget Gordon Child, sort of founder of modern archaeology, was a Marxist. They openly reject surplus theory. Some Bowles endorses the same Polanyi criticism to the surplus approach that I presented earlier in my presentation. And then they are familiar in my department, so they don't quote me, of course. But I wonder whether they echoed something, they heard something about my... Anyway, in my work in progress, available on request, I argue that while the reference to the material triggers of social change is appreciable, it has a Marxist flavor, the utilization of marginalist interpretative tools is disputable. What is interesting, but the judgment I leave to you, that these tests are carried on very large databases built on archaeological findings. I don't know whether you find this way to proceed correct, but this I leave to you. I'm just criticizing the methodological side of these papers. On the methodological side, these studies recover the formalist tradition, employing marginalist concept, in particular the relative scarcity of production factors, to explain the onset of inequality. These concepts are of doubtful, spurious nature, although their use might please conventional economic thinking. They eliminate the problem with capital, arguing that this employment in antiquities was negligible. Is oxen and plow insignificant? The use of oxen and plow, they are capital goods, actually. In this regard, but I mean, let us admit that capital did not exist as a production factor in antiquity, and we can neglect it. Ammesse non concesso, as we say in Italian. In this regard, I found useful a less known Zeraffa's critique to the application of neoclassical curves. Intuitively, the marginal downsloping demand curves for factors and commodities have behind the idea that at each moment of time, a significant number of alternative techniques are adoptable at different prices. This hypothesis is already questionable in a capitalist context, where one can imagine that teams of engineering have designed, on the basis of the given technical knowledge, a range of the most cost-effective techniques, proportion between factors, relative to a continuum of relative factor prices. So, I mean, these neoclassical curves are implicitly at the same time a large number, if not an infinite number, of techniques alternative to the present, the one in use. If there is a change in relative factor prices, firms are very rapidly can move to another technique. It is there. But I mean, it's just crazy to assume that. Only techniques in use, or maybe obsolete techniques that are not adopted anymore, are known to producers. This requires much fantasy and little realism, and it is therefore even more questionable when used in pre-capitalist formations, as the paper previously quoted do, even as a heuristic. Some conclusion about this, what I call materialist marginalism. Neoclassical functions live at most illogical time, what Marx defined generic abstractions. Their employment to describe capitalism is questionable. In a prehistoric context, is bizarre. I mean, note this is an additional criticism to marginalism, in addition to the capital theory criticism. Of course, the same stories narrated by the marginalists can be told by integrating the surplus theory with historical institutional analysis, as done by Halstead, Scott, and even Allen on Egypt. The classical approach would focus on potentially observable magnitudes, including a prevailing technique in use, considering the adoption of new techniques in historical time as a result of the change in inputs prices or of technical change. Okay, and do not forget that besides these methodological objections, classical theory is analytical faulty when capital is introduced. Some conclusions and perspectives. There are signs of unsatisfaction with new institutional economics hegemony. This is sometimes expressed in moral terms. New institutional economics, an excessive focus on growth, little attention to inequality, to social cost of growth, etc. To which the Stanford historians, I mean, Stanford is a main center of historian working using new institutional economics, would reply saying, well, but we are open to this moral plea. Please work and develop a theory also in direction of paying more attention to inequality, social cost, etc. So I don't think that these moral objections are, decisive to criticize new institutional economics. So we need, therefore, a deeper criticism of the theoretical background on new institutional economics. I mean, other criticisms, for instance, would point out to the fact that new institutional economics in modern times, regarding modern times, has very much affected the so-called Washington consensus. From my friend, my fellow economist, Danny Roderick, wrote a paper on that, on new institutional economics and the Washington consensus. But we must go beyond this moral criticism. Students of ancient economists are already familiar with the concept of surplus. This is a noble tradition that has now been retrieved and revived. There is therefore space for an interdisciplinary work based on reciprocity and not the imperialist attitude that neoclassical economists have, and not on the one side imperialism. Where to go? No doubt that mainstream economists have the power, resources, and organizational ability to guide the dances. Any dissidence is moreover progressively eliminated from the faculties of economics. Necessary would be a textbook for alternative economic theories for ancient studies. It would be a great experience. There would be a lot that modern classical economists could learn too. Okay, I stop here because I think that we will to discuss them with Marco Maiura. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Professor Cesaratto.
Dr. Piccolo.
1 second.